Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on Victoria's housing puzzle, how better planning and infrastructure can make room for more homes. I'm Jonathan Spear, CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, and really pleased that you're joining us this morning, where we're going to be diving deeper into some of the recommendations that Infrastructure Victoria has made regarding housing, planning and infrastructure. We're going to get to talk to some very special guests for their views on this subject, and we're going to get to your questions as well. And we know from feedback that many of you have given us that this is a topic that there is a desire for us to dive deeper into. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. As we're going through, you can see that you can post questions in the Slido screen beneath you. And we've already had lots of questions come through ahead. So we're going to get to those later on. But before we do that, let me introduce some of our special guests. So really pleased to introduce Catherine Sunderman. So Catherine is a senior lecturer in urban design and planning at Monash University. We've also got with us Patrick Fensham. Patrick is the Victorian president of the Planning Institute of Australia and may be known to many of you for his work at SGS Planning and Economics as well. And we also are joined by Matthew Bowes. And so Matthew is a senior associate at the Grantham Institute and has been involved in much of their really interesting work that is very complementary to much of the work that Infrastructure Victoria has been doing. So Catherine, Matt and Patrick will be joining us a little bit later on. Before that, I'm going to give you all a bit of a chef's selection of the recommendations in the 30-year infrastructure strategy. Before we proceed any further, though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today. So here in Infrastructure Victoria's office, that is the Wurundjeri people. So I would very much like to pay my respects to elders and anyone who might be joining us today. And also, of course, to observe that all of the housing and land and infrastructure that we are talking about today is situated on traditional lands throughout Victoria. Many of you are probably familiar with Infrastructure Victoria, but just in case you're joining us for the first time, we are the state's independent infrastructure advisor. We give advice to the Victorian Government and Parliament on all the infrastructure and related issues like housing and planning that the state has an interest in. And we do that through the 30-year infrastructure strategy, which I'll be giving you a summary of shortly, but also through independent research and advice to the government. And you might be aware we've done quite a lot of that over recent years on things like housing choices and the shape of our city. You can find a lot more of that information available on our website. So in November of last year, we tabled the latest update to Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy. And it contains 45 recommendations to the Victorian Government about the highest priority projects and reforms we recommend the government get underway in the next 5 years. It also identifies 8 future options, which are either projects or reforms that we think government needs to be having on its radar, not necessarily for implementation in the next 5 years, but certainly be starting to plan for. And these recommendations and future options cover all sorts of areas of infrastructure. Today, I'm going to be describing to you the ones that are most relevant to housing and planning and the role of infrastructure in delivering more housing. Importantly, while there's lots of technical analysis that underpins these recommendations, it's also been informed by lots of community engagement and submissions. And I know many of you who are joining us today and your organisations made submissions to us while we developed the strategy. And I really want to thank you for that. It made a real difference to us. We had thousands of points of feedback and it resulted in both new recommendations and options being delivered for the final strategy, but updates to every single one of the recommendations that made them better informed and more powerful recommendations to government. Now, if you haven't yet dived into the detail of the 30-year strategy, do yourself a favour Not right now, because you should be watching this webinar, but after the webinar, you can jump into our website, which you're of course watching this webinar on, and you can search by topics that you're interested in. You can search by recommendations. You can also find many interactive apps and additional information. So if you want to know more about any of the recommendations we're talking about today, jump onto our website. All right, so I'm going to dive now into some of the recommendations we've made that are most relevant to delivery of more housing across Victoria. Recommendation number one of the strategy is to build more social homes. We're recommending investment in a long-term program to build 60,000 more social homes over the next 15 years. To give Victorians who are on the lowest of incomes with secure and affordable housing. And importantly, we've also recommended that part of this program be focused on the housing needs of Aboriginal people and building the capacity in the Aboriginal housing sector as well. We've recommended continued focus on rezoning of locations near existing infrastructure to provide more home choices. Of course, there's been quite a lot of activity by the Victorian government in the last couple of years in unlocking more housing, particularly around train and tram zones. What we observe is that there are probably more opportunities to do that in places with good access to public transport and open space and services in other parts of our cities in Victoria, both in Melbourne, but in particular in our regional cities where there is an unexploited opportunity to unlock more housing choices in the established areas of those cities where there is good existing infrastructure. Now we come to a couple of those future options I was describing earlier. So things that we think government needs to be planning for and working through, not necessarily for immediate implementation, but certainly working through. And we had lots of submissions when we were delivering the strategy about the role affordable housing can play and affordable housing mechanisms, particularly to give people more housing choices near good infrastructure for low-income households. The thing we observed and had lots of feedback on is that there is very inconsistent mechanisms for how we require and deliver affordable housing at the moment. The other thing we heard loud and clear is that affordable housing requirements can serve as an inadvertent brake on the feasibility of housing being delivered if it's not done in a way that enables the development to stack up. So that's why we're recommending the Victorian government do more work on this, and we've identified some options in other jurisdictions that are quite promising on that. The other future option we have talked about is phasing out of residential stamp duties and phasing in of a residential land tax. Now, many economists recommend this for all sorts of reasons. Infrastructure Victoria recommends it because the current stamp duty regime serves as a real brake on people's housing choices and their ability to live in the place that allows them to best serve what their needs are at a particular time, and certainly serves as a brake on people's ability to access and move to areas with good infrastructure at the best time of their lives that suit them. We've got a number of recommendations about the importance of open space, which of course we know from our work with communities is a key requirement for people to have livable cities, and for there to be more people living in established areas. We need to continue to have good quality open space. So we're recommending continued opening up of public land, especially in fast-growing suburbs. So that's things like utilities land, respectful and appropriate use of cemeteries, and sometimes shared use of existing open space in places like golf courses. In addition, we think there should be continued effort to plant more trees in local streets to head towards a broader 30% or more tree canopy cover in urban areas. The other aspect of open space, which we've done quite a lot of research on, and there's another whole webinar on this if you'd like to dive into it on our website, is around opportunities to help government schools share their grounds with the community outside of school hours. There's real benefits to communities and schools for that open space to be unlocked And we know that there are communities across Melbourne, in particular, some of the less well-off communities in Melbourne that need more open space, where if we give schools the additional funding and policy guidance, that can really help them unlock the billions of dollars worth of open space that sits there with our state schools. Moving on to some of our transport recommendations. There's lots of transport recommendations in our strategy. Today, I just wanted to bring your attention to a couple that are really integrated with the delivery of more homes. So we've done a lot of work on opportunities to extend the tram network in Melbourne. And if you want to dive deeper into some of that, there's some technical reports on our website. But what that identifies is the ability to deliver more trams in Fisherman's Bend and Arden to unlock those precincts, of which would have them tens of thousands of more homes planned. In addition, you can see on the maps here that we've identified corridors in the north of Melbourne and the east and the southeast that not only would they have really good improvements to transport connectivity, but if we rezoned around the areas of those tram extensions, we'd unlock tens of thousands more new homes as well. And all of this work is underpinned, I should say, by really strong cost-benefit analysis results, and that is also available if you're interested on our website. Staying with the transport theme, we've recommended duplication and additional electrification and signalling upgrades in Melbourne's inner north towards Upfield. If we do this, that would serve as an important way of meeting the transport needs of the inner north and connect to future extensions that we've identified further in Melbourne's growth areas of the north. But in the shorter run, it also unlocks a lot more housing with that improved tram service, rezoning and an additional station at Campbellfield. That's a really big opportunity for us to unlock, again, tens of thousands more homes. We've got a lot of work that's been done to underpin the strategy on the importance and opportunity that sits with continued building out of strategic cycling corridors. These also have really strong demand and cost-benefit analysis results, but their connection with housing and infrastructure is the thing I'd really like to draw your attention today. That what we know is that many of the precincts and activity centres that the government is planning to unlock currently will work much better if there is safe, separated cycling connections within and connecting out from them to other areas of the city. And that will give much more transport choices as well as helping unlock more housing choices. Now, I think we're only going to come to this when we have our discussion with our panelists, but we've had really strong feedback over many years about the need to reform infrastructure contributions, that the connections between the ability to deliver and fund the infrastructure that more housing needs, those connections are frayed, and that there's a real opportunity to reform the existing infrastructure contributions system. At Infrastructure Victoria, we've been asked by the Treasurer to do some more work on that. And if you're interested in understanding that, please jump on our website. But in the meantime, we are recommending continued focus on expansion of the types of housing development that infrastructure contribution regimes cover, and simplification of the approach as well, so it's more predictable. Last but not least, there's a really important connection between the planning we do for our future population, housing and land use, and the infrastructure we need. Many councils are required to deliver infrastructure plans for their communities. But what we observe is that in many instances, there aren't state-level plans that complement those council-level plans. And in the absence of that, it's really difficult for councils, not-for-profit and private investors to play their part in achieving the vision for future housing, population and jobs growth. So there'll be a real benefit in publishing strategic level plans for state government infrastructure. And that's something that's been done in places like New South Wales and South Australia. And so they're models that we can learn from. We know that would really help align everybody's efforts to deliver more housing and make the best use of the infrastructure we have. So with that, now I'm going to turn to our panelists. And I'm going to start perhaps with you, Catherine. Love to hear from you about your reflections on how the recommendations in the 30-year infrastructure strategy that I've just been describing connect with some of the work that you've been doing at Monash University and the diverse forums in which you operate.
Yes. Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thank you for that incredible introduction of those recommendations. And certainly it's got a strong connection with what I'm looking at Monash University, which is how do we actually create livable neighbourhoods when we look at intensifying existing areas of the city. And so I wanted to especially thank Infrastructure Victoria for that advocacy over the last, I would say, 4 years or so, or I'm sure more, about encouraging that idea of more housing in established cities. And certainly we see things like the activity centre program that the Victorian government's been looking at coming in part from that work. So my role has been looking at programs like that and looking at, are they actually creating livable neighbourhoods? Because rezoning alone doesn't necessarily create livable neighbourhoods. We know that we actually need place-based planning. We need, as you're kind of saying about that need for those state-level plans, we need to be looking at the specifics of a place and responding to that. We need to involve community in the formation of these plans, and we need to plan upfront for what makes a livable place, whether it's schools or community facilities, parks, street trees, making sure that it's a walkable place. And also looking at the role of government and having more of a custodianship role in terms of that transformation. So I think many of those recommendations that you mentioned, really, when you come down to that kind of neighbourhood level, how do we make sure that you've got a community-generated plan that's actually helping make that all happen? I think that's something that I'm looking to advocate for, because in the current planning changes, it's often about automating or abstracting how those planning changes are happening, and I'm not sure that it's going to create those livable places that we're wanting to see.
Thanks, Catherine. And so speaking of planning changes, it's probably a good segue to you, Pat, as president of the Planning Institute. How do these recommendations from Infrastructure Victoria sit with the agenda of change that the Planning Institute has been advocating for?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this seminar. So look, yeah, and there's a lot of alignment, as Kath mentioned, with the PIA agenda and some of the PIA position statements that we have. First up, though, I'd really like to congratulate Infrastructure Victoria with its lead as the first recommendation on more social housing and more social homes. I think that's a really bold statement. And it's for 60,000 social house dwellings over, you said 15 years. It's a great recommendation. But if you do the numbers on that, that just maintains the current share of social housing that we have, which is around 3% or so. So it would make a tiny improvement, but it just goes to indicate the size of the task that we've got to make inroads into affordable housing need or the lack of affordability and the impacts on low income people. So congratulations on that one, but more work to do. So on some of the others, I think PIA's position probably could be summarised into sort of 4 key points. We certainly agree with Catherine that we need to sort of move on from the focus on rezoning. There's been plenty of work done in that space in Victoria, and as you say, there's probably more work to be done. But 4 things that are really important is one is coordinated and sequenced infrastructure provision. So that starts providing signals to the market about where to direct investment into established areas. And that aligns with your recommendation 36 on infrastructure plans. The second is the focus on livability outcomes, a little bit consistent with Catherine, but we've stuck our neck out and said, well, there's probably 5 things. Oh, there's a dog barking. I'm sorry about that. There's probably 5 things which are universal places which we really focus on in terms of livability. And they're, of course, additional open space, an accessible open space, trying to reduce car reliance, and local walkability, tree cover, and of course the social and affordable housing to get a mix in those places. Apologies for the dog. I'll deal with that when I move on to the next speaker. The third one is incentives and interventions for land assembly. So that's probably something you haven't covered, Jonathan, but we think a government role there provides a pipeline of housing sites, and it's really important, and we'll need that sort of targeted intervention by government. And the fourth is that we do need a robust system of infrastructure charging, and we've put a focus on the idea of a development license fee or value capture to provide the resources in place for the infrastructure spend that we'd like to see. And that system would be calibrated to land value uplift in different parts of the city. So it's a varied charge that would apply universally across renewal and redevelopment areas. So those four things are starting ones. And there's a bit of your recommendation there, of course, in 37. So you can see the recommendation 37. So you can sort of see some alignment there that we've got between your recommendations and the position statements that the Planning Institute's got.
Thanks, Pat. Well, it's great to see that alignment. We might dig into some of those ideas a bit more as we start to answer people's questions, because it's pretty closely related to some of those areas that people have interest in. But before we do that, let's go to you, Matthew. Of course, at Grattan, you guys have been doing some really interesting work diving into the nuts and bolts and the economics of housing as well. Yeah, how do these recommendations and themes sit with the work that you've been doing at Grattan?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. I think it does fit in a lot with a lot of the work we've been doing at Grattan, and I think there's a couple of points in particular that I think sort of intersect between the work that we've been doing, which, as you say, has in particular been looking at this question of how can we ensure that there's more homes in the places people want to live, but also ensure that when we're looking at planning reforms, we choose the right ones, the ones that are going to ensure that homes are economical to build, because at the end of the day, we need to rely in many instances on the private sector to build these homes. That's the role of government here is allowing the space, and then we've got to figure out how we can get those homes built. And given the low share of social and affordable homes, as we've been talking about, a lot of those are going to be built by the private sector. So we need to think about how the private sector interacts with all these development controls. So I think that the 3 points that I'd particularly be keen to touch on, the first is around the concept of what's the appropriate scale when we're talking about transport-oriented upzoning. So, our work tends to show, I think, that Victoria has probably some of the nation's leading policies when it comes to transport-oriented upzoning. We've compared the work that's been done in New South Wales to Victoria, and definitely Victoria's reforms look more ambitious. But one point in which I think they are going to struggle is around this scale of density that they're looking to permit. So particularly around the activity centres, there's a sort of higher density core, but most of the centres are looking in that 4 to 6 story apartment range. And what we've shown and what our work shows is that that's a bit of a dead zone when it comes to profitability or feasibility of development for private developers. So when we're looking at something like a 3-story townhouse, that's quite affordable to build, and that sells quite a premium. And so often what will happen if you try and allow, say, 4-story apartments is you'll get a lot of 3-story townhouses. Whereas our work shows if you look at the low and mid-rise housing areas in New South Wales where they've looked to upzone, a lot of the sites that they've upzoned wouldn't be feasible at 4 stories, but would be feasible at something in the range of 6 to 9 stories. So that's the kind of thing where more targeted upzoning around areas that we think are well connected to transport would enable that higher density, but also would ensure that we're not underbuilding at the moment. So we need to look to be ambitious there. I think the second point, and this goes to the question of where these new homes are going to be built, is around the role of heritage. So around 29% of the residential land within 10 kilometres of Melbourne is under a heritage overlay. And I think what our work would show is that has a significant impact on development. So our analysis shows that on average, those kind of sites that are under heritage overlays compared to similar sites are about half as likely to be redeveloped in the period we looked at. And that really is a significant area of our land that we are sort of locking up for the moment. And a lot of the heritage policies we have, I don't think appropriately allow for things like adaptive redevelopment. Redevelopment within the context of heritage, I think, is something that we have seen done really well, say in the city of Melbourne. But I think there's definitely further we could go to look to review those policies, look at their scope, but also look at ways of ensuring that where we are doing heritage protection, we still can allow for densification. We can allow for more homes, especially near the public transport in places that we think are really, really great places for people to live, and we want people to live without having to be reliant on cars to get around. I think the final point on cars is, I think our work would point to the really high cost of parking minimums requiring people to put parking in new housing. The Victorian government's made some important reforms here. They've reduced parking minimums, particularly in areas that are close to public transport. But we think there's a really principled case for going further and removing parking minimums altogether, because really they are among the most costly ways that we could try and solve this problem of managing cars in our urban space. So, we've got things like permits for on-street parking, charging for on-street parking, congestion charging, which is something that you discussed in your report, which I think is really positive. There's many ways that we can look to manage car demand in addition to providing public transport and better infrastructure. So forcing people to put car parks in their homes that they may not want, and that in many cases actually cost more to build than they cost to sell. I think that's something that we need to take a really close look at, and is currently a really big barrier to allowing these places to densify as we provide better infrastructure and as we upzone them over time. So I think they're really, really interesting discussions, and really grateful to see Infrastructure Victoria stepping into this space and taking a really good close look at how we can allow more homes in the places people want to live in our cities, because it's among our most pressing problems, I think, in Victoria and nationwide.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And what you started to talk about really closely connects to a theme of lots of the questions that have been coming through from audience members in the webinar, who are asking about how is it that we can make housing in established suburbs something that is actually affordable and real for people? How can we really unlock that choice? And lots of people identify in their questions the challenge of aligning where jobs are with where housing is, and where, while some people want to live in the green fields, and our work shows that, many people want to have a choice that is not a greenfields choice. And some of what you've described, Matt, is some of the unlocking of that, and we certainly agree on some of the car parking issues. That we know from our work that definitely adds cost where it's not always needed by residents of housing. Maybe, Catherine, would you like to then step into the conversation at this point again around, what's it actually going to take to make homes in well-connected suburbs in Victoria really within reach of more Victorians?
That's such a good question, and obviously one of the main things we're discussing today. There is a lot of discussion, and I think it's housing supply and housing affordability are really important topics to look at, but that kind of connection between housing supply and affordability is somewhat contested, and we know that it does have an effect, but it takes a very long time. And so what is much more proven is actually delivering social and affordable housing. And so if we want to have more affordable options for people close to jobs, close to public transport, making sure that programs like the Activity Centre program actually lock in minimum affordable housing contributions. And we know that that's certainly something that's been done in New South Wales as part of the Transit Orientated Development Program. And it's been quite modest there. Some of the first 8 sites have up to 15% affordable housing requirements, but across the board, it's as little as 2% for projects over 2,000 square metres. But having something like that as a minimum, and they also look at having kind of uplifts if you provide affordable housing. So these are small things that we can be looking at. But more broadly, if we want to make real change, having more broad-based land taxes, for example, that contribute directly to a social housing fund would be essential in terms of actually delivering more affordable and social housing. So that's kind of key in terms of actually having affordability, giving people options. I think that's really great. But those other things that were mentioned, I completely agree about the role of car parking being a big cost for these new projects. And certainly getting rid of minimum requirements is an important step. But I do think that also looking at precinct-based parking solutions is crucial too. I actually live in Nightingale Village, which is a project that has very minimal car parking, but there are some people that do require parking, and having a precinct solution is essential to help people that might require car use occasionally, but would really incentivise them primarily using public transport and reducing the cost of those apartments.
Thanks, Catherine. And Pat, turning to you, what do you think is sitting behind why homes in established suburbs are still out of reach for many people, and what role can better infrastructure planning play in unlocking more housing choices?
Well, look, there's plenty of non-planning factors, of course, that are adding to the cost of construction. But if we stay in our lane here, a couple of things come to mind and one is, we've already discussed it, but real certainty on where the infrastructure rollout is heading is really important. And again, you've got some recommendations around that, much greater clarity on where government's going to be spending its money, so there's certainty for the development sector. And the second thing is you've certainly signalled the idea of a policy around inclusionary zoning for social and affordable housing, or some sort of requirement, and Catherine's alluded to that. We'd like to see that brought forward, not just as a future option, but as something that's rather urgent and required in the short term. And then the other thing is, I'll elaborate a little bit on a point that I made earlier and make a historical connection to the establishment of the land development corporations in the 70s, which was incentivised by the Whitlam Labor government, and that was tackling issues that we've got as similar today on the urban fringe, so in greenfield areas. And I think there really is, we need to really rethink the role of Development Victoria and the sort of interventions which could occur to provide innovations. And that was one of the motivations or the rationale for those land development corporations in the 70s, was to innovate around housing product and show the way and do demonstration projects. So I accept Matthew's point that the vast majority of the housing is going to be provided by the private sector, but there's a real role in established areas for a lead role for Development Victoria to be innovating in this space to show the way, because it is risky to move into sort of new forms of development, new technologies, new production techniques, and new types of housing. And I think there's really a role for government to lead the way in some of those areas.
Right, thanks, Pat. Now we might move on to another theme that's coming up in the questions. A lot of people are interested in digging a bit deeper on the recommendations around extension of trams in established areas of Melbourne and the way that connects to unlocking of more homes. And as I said earlier, we've identified a number of routes that have got both good transport outcomes, but also real opportunities for more housing to be unlocked. Matthew, I'd be interested in your perspective on this in terms of how extending tram routes might contribute to more homes being built in the right places.
Yeah, well, certainly, I think it's a really interesting recommendation, and I think one of the points that I think is really relevant right now. We've obviously seen large increases in construction costs and construction costs across both housing and broader infrastructure projects since COVID, but we're seeing again in the wake of the Iran war that there is another increase potentially in construction costs coming through the pipeline, because construction is very energy intensive, and as energy gets more expensive, construction gets more expensive. So I think it really puts a premium on how governments are spending on these big infrastructure projects that they are delivering. When we look at total infrastructure spending, total infrastructure activity since before COVID, housing is pretty flat. We're sort of almost back to where we were in terms of construction activity prior to COVID-19. But now we've seen this large increase in private infrastructure spending, so for things, private engineering spending, so things like the clean energy transition, and then public infrastructure spending. So obviously large transport projects have been a big source of construction activity. So thinking about ways that we can spend our construction dollars better when it comes to public money, to ensure that we get the most value for money and reduce the capacity constraints that exist that make a difference when it comes to our housing crisis and also the energy transition. I think that's really important. So something like these tram extensions, which, as you said, have, I think, really strong cost benefit profiles and also are among the lower cost ways that we could do transport oriented upzoning in our cities. I think they are definitely worth a look. And in terms of what that means, I mean, this question around how we can make our suburbs more affordable, I think what our work shows is that ultimately that affordability has to come through building more homes. So we've seen over an extended period of time that the growth rate in Australia's housing supply has fallen from the really highs we saw post World War II, even as our population growth has held pretty constant. We're now seeing immigration replace a lot of the population growth that previously came through natural births. And so that means we do need to continue to build at the same rate we did previously, and we're not doing that. So thinking about ways we can add homes in our inner cities makes sense, and it particularly makes sense when we consider that Melbourne is among the least dense cities of its size in the world. One of the stats we have in our report is that if Melbourne was as dense as Los Angeles within the first 15 kilometres from the CBD, we'd have space for more than 400,000 homes. And I don't think people think of Los Angeles as a particularly dense city, but certainly the planning controls that we've previously put in place have reduced the density of our cities a lot, and Melbourne is no exception to that.
Yeah, that really messes with your mind, doesn't it? Because everyone thinks about LA being a really sprawly, car-centric city, and so that's why sometimes drilling into the data and doing those comparisons can be really useful. Catherine or Pat, did either of you have views around the value of tram extensions and its connections to building more homes that you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's all kind of very front of mind, as you were mentioning, with the oil crisis not only affecting construction costs, but also people's vulnerability to, if they're needing to be very car dependent, there's a real challenge there. And it's been good to see that great RMIT work they did with the vampire maps that kind of show that dependence on oil and kind of risk of kind of increase in mortgage costs. I don't know if I'm sure many people have seen those maps, but it starts to really paint a picture of the risks that are involved in delivering more housing that isn't well located. So certainly increasing tram lines enables more people to have that option of using public transport. So I think that's an excellent thing. And I think one thing that we could look a bit harder on in Victoria is really linking that accessibility to public transport to density. This has been something that's been quite well achieved in Sydney, for example, and certainly something that we could look at in greater detail in introducing density controls and really tying them to that level of accessibility so that we don't, I know there's a lot of focus on with the low-rise code, having townhouses as a major form of housing delivery across Melbourne. But there's a risk there if we do become the capital of townhouses, that if those townhouses aren't in well-located areas, we're actually locking in that car dependence for many people. So again, increasing the amount of public transport, as you say, trams are a lower cost way of doing that. That's an excellent thing that we should be looking at.
Jonathan, look, I just think we need to work much harder at making it possible to live without a car, so the tram extensions are one idea. And the other thing that maybe you've missed in your corridors there, and it's funny, you sometimes find yourself on YouTube looking at nerds who look at Melbourne's trams and trains, and there's some really good stuff there. And I found myself looking at one a little while ago where the guy had identified 5 or 6 really modest extensions to the tram network, which would create an interchange with train stations. So I think there's some really low-hanging fruit there about modest interventions which could create a better, denser network. And that's why I sometimes get nervous with these comparisons with other cities that Matthew's made, because the historical context, when the cities were developed, when the public transport was put in, the nature of transport and travel, they're all quite unique to these cities. But one of the things we do know is that the cities that have the lowest car usage or the highest public transport modes, they have dense public transport networks. So there's lots of alternatives to get around the city, not just radial in and out. We know Suburban Rail Loop's trying to do something like that, but much denser public transport networks that have a combination of trains, buses, trams, light rail, whatever it might be. And I think that is the next step in our thinking for Melbourne's development, to create a network of public transport in our established areas, which means that you can move in multiple directions.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I think,
go
sorry,
ahead,
Jonathan,
Andrew.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
I think one thing that we should probably mention here is this concept of choice as well. I think something that I think is tricky here is that a lot of the time we know that there are great cities where people can live without cars, and that's definitely something that should be an option for people in Australia. But I think it's tricky when we sort of start from the perspective that that's the best thing, and that hence we should plan for that, rather than thinking about how can we make that something that people will choose. Because I think the problem when we are trying to plan for cities, I think as we have done in some instances in Australia, we try and plan for cities where we allow density only in some locations and not in others. We ignore the fact that cities grow and change over time, and there are people who would like to live in great, well-located areas that perhaps don't have good public transport today, but do have other good connections and that could have those connections in future. So rather than, I think, starting from the position that we should only upzone in areas with public transport, we should, I think, look to upzone broadly, and we should look to ensure that the public transport investment we make brings people to those areas. So rather than limiting people, giving them the choices and ensuring that the choices that we would like them to have are the best ones. So I think that's potentially a better framework, rather than starting from this perspective that we need to be limiting, say, townhouses because they're the types of things that we don't want. And that enabling that choice is often, I think, a better way for governments to think about this potentially, rather than thinking about, the government may know best about what people would like. I think that can get us into some tricky places.
Yeah, it's a very interesting way to think about it, Matt. And, long-time IV watchers will know that we have certainly framed some of our work through the lens of choice, particularly work on our home choices, where we sought to identify, well, why do people choose to live where they do? And we know that many people choose to live in greenfield areas for really rational reasons, and they're making trade-offs that they understand. But that shouldn't be the only choice that people have, is one of the key challenges we've got. And of course, Matthew, you talk about, people being able to live in all sorts of different areas and having infrastructure that then would support that. The big question is, well, how do we pay for that? And one of the reasons, of course, that Infrastructure Victoria has recommended a focus on more homes in areas where there's good existing infrastructure is that we get more value out of that. But we also know that we've got to catch up and keep up with the infrastructure we need to support growing communities in greenfield areas and established areas, and not just in Melbourne, in our regional cities as well. And so many of the questions that are coming through from audience members are related to this question of, and frustration about delays in delivery of infrastructure and how we pay for it. And Pat, I might start with you and to get your views, I suppose, on how we can do better at funding and delivering the infrastructure we need. But also, you mentioned earlier around the sort of development license model. That might be worth explaining a little bit more as well.
Yeah, well, look, the system needs simplifying, but one of the things that we have overlooked, I think, is the idea that as the state provides development rights through the development approval system, and that will increase land values in locations where the rezoning is occurring and where those development approvals are being granted. And we've missed the opportunity often to capture a share of the value of those development rights to reinvest in infrastructure. And I suppose the most glaring example that we all know about in Victoria is Fisherman's Bend. The rezoning went ahead. There was no value capture regime in place, and now we're short of the infrastructure that would stimulate development in that area. So what we've talked about in some of the Planning Institute's position statements is the idea of this development licence fee, which is another name for a value capture system, but where the value of those development rights is captured as part of the development approval process. And we've seen a very successful system, or a system in the ACT, which is linked to its leasehold land tenure, but which requires a payment equivalent to a share of the value uplift or the land value uplift when development approval is granted for more intense development. And I think it's a relatively simple system. It's scheduled. You know what you're up for in each part of Canberra as you develop for the particular development type you're doing. And I think it would be one of the reforms which would recognise the community's share of the value of development rights, but also provide a stream of funding for infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. And Catherine, turning to you, on this question of, how do we pay for the infrastructure that we need in all sorts of development settings? What do you think about what some of the biggest opportunities are we should be exploring?
Absolutely. I think just to kind of reinforce what Pat was saying and what you mentioned as well, Jonathan, in Victoria, we have such a patchwork of infrastructure contributions at the moment. We know that some new infrastructure contributions are brought into the Activity Centre program from 2027, but and in the greenfields, we have well-established infrastructure contributions, but across different councils, it varies greatly and it's at a lower rate than other comparable states. So certainly having just a base level of the kind of amount of contributions that are provided by each development. But I think there's potential as well at looking at the role that place-based planning can play in terms of actually delivering infrastructure up front. And it was great that someone mentioned Fisherman's Bend, because we saw a situation where it was all rezoned. There was, the trebling of the land value. And then you had a situation where the master planning for that area happened after that upzoning had occurred. And so councils had to buy back small little pocket parks at 3 times the cost of what it had already been. Whereas if we did that kind of planning for infrastructure with the community in specific places before it was rezoned, we could actually identify which areas would be for open space. And certainly some of the TOD program in New South Wales have seen that, where there's been community involvement in developing different scenarios. They've identified even existing houses that will be turned into a park in the future as part of the upzoning process. And then they have enough contributions from the new developments that take place that actually fund the delivery of those parks and street upgrades. So I think certainly being a bit more sophisticated in that rezoning process, actually planning up front for that local infrastructure that's required and having the right mechanisms to kind of capture some of that value uplift, as Pat mentioned. And I think something that Pat has also mentioned was that idea of government as a custodian. And an example that I've seen of that is in New Zealand. So in Auckland, there's a place called Northcote, sorry, it's pronounced differently over there. And there was actually a partnership between Ekapanaku, which was the City of Auckland's development agency, and also the kind of their national social housing agency looked at this neighbourhood of Northcote that was all kind of single houses, and they collectively funded the daylighting of a creek through the middle of that area. Then the council development agency actually bought up the little 1950s shops in the town centre so they could redevelop it at 8 stories and include new shops underneath. And then the social housing agency actually redeveloped their social housing at, I think it was 4 or 5 times the density, with a third social housing, a third affordable, and a third private housing. And so you can see there you've got government partnerships coming together for specific places and helping lead the transformation, helping deliver some of that amenity that will actually unlock private development. So I think they're the kind of things that we could be, so it's not only about infrastructure contributions, it's also about that kind of place-based planning for that kind of local infrastructure that we need. And it's also about having a bit more kind of government leadership and coordination in its delivery.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And, your comments about the connections between good planning and good funding are really consistent with what we're finding in our work, that the two are inextricable. You can't know what you need to fund unless you've done the planning. And it's difficult to do the planning unless you know you've got some sense of and predictability of the mechanisms by which you're going to do the funding. But turning to you, Matt, Grattan are always pretty good when it comes to dollars and cents on all sorts of issues. What are your thoughts on and how we pay for the infrastructure we need in all sorts of different growth contexts for housing?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to sort of pull out two kinds of infrastructure that we're trying to fund here. And I think the first kind is probably the kind that we've done better, which is the infrastructure in greenfield areas. And that's infrastructure where it really mainly benefits people in those precincts that we're creating in those new suburbs. And in that context, clearly it makes sense that those kinds of the developers who are funding that, but also the people who are there should be able to pay for that infrastructure because it ultimately benefits them. And without it, we won't be able to build those homes. And I think you could make the same argument probably around a lot of brownfield redevelopment sites like Fisherman's Bend. I think where it gets tricky is when we're talking about infrastructure that benefits the broader community and trying not to just fund that infrastructure through effectively a tax on people who are, the people who are buying into these new areas. So when we're thinking about existing suburbs, I think that's where the case becomes a bit stronger to think about better funding mechanisms. So, I think, you've raised in your work the idea of transitioning from stamp duty to land tax. I think one thing that is really nice about land tax compared to stamp duty is just that it's less volatile, and so that it allows governments to plan better about what kinds of revenue they'll have if we build in new areas to build new infrastructure that benefits not just the people who are coming to an area when we densify, but also the existing residents, people who are already there, who can benefit if we build more infrastructure when we build more housing. So I think that's probably the distinction we should be looking for, is how much of this infrastructure is benefiting just the people who are there versus how much of it is benefiting the broader community and hence should be funded by everyone, not just people who are buying a new apartment or a new townhouse, say.
Yeah, and of course that issue is becoming a much bigger issue than it has been in the past for us as we look to have more housing in established areas, which is making the best use of the infrastructure we've got, but is going to need some enhancements as well. Yeah. The other question that's coming through from lots of people who are involved in the webinar is around the diversity of mix of housing available. And we've got questions about, where do the audio engineers, the screen printers, the freelance artists, the sewers, where are they going to live? They may want to live in an established area, but they don't want to live in a one-bedroom apartment, and that doesn't suit them very well. Where do families live? Is it realistic for families to live in one-bedroom apartments? So how can we unlock a more diverse choice of housing that's available for people, some of which might relate to the economics of it, some of the planning, some of the design rules. Catherine, I think you might have looked at some of this in Australia and overseas as well, haven't you?
Absolutely. I think there's really two parts to that question. And firstly, I really loved that description of audio engineers, screen printers, freelance artists. It's so important to plan for a diversity of different people, but I haven't heard that exact grouping before, so I quite liked that. But I think the important thing is that on one hand, we need to be ensuring that there is that right diversity of types of housing. But then the other really important part is that the neighbourhood that they're in actually allows for them to kind of fully live their lives that they want to live. And so perhaps the screen printer, if there was a kind of below market affordable workplace that they could work from in their neighbourhood, it could actually be a great solution that means they don't need such a larger house. But agreed, diversity is really important. Apologies for that.
And
sorry about that. I just had some more points to make. My phone was ringing. But just so if we want to get that diversity, the Vancouver housing strategy actually shows that they don't just have housing targets, and they've had this since 2012. They actually have targets for the different income groups, but interestingly, number of bedrooms and typology. So townhouses versus apartments, and then they report on that and see how that kind of diversity is coming through. So I think that's really valuable. But then another great reference is the great work from Natalia Kriziak, who actually looked at what it would take to make great family apartments. And so she looked at a lot of regulations around the world that actively encouraged families to live in apartments, such as in Norway and Canada and other places. And some of the things that they looked at was having things like storage for prams, or actually having more common space within the building where families can play. So I think both looking at the kind of regulations and incentives to encourage the diversity of housing types, but then also looking at what's in that neighbourhood so that people also have parks or that nearby, or that they can walk to school, or that kind of affordable workplace in the neighbourhood as well.
Yeah, thanks. There's some really interesting examples. Pat, I was interested in the degree to which diversity of housing choice relates to the point you were making earlier about land assembly and the importance of land assembly to get the maximum amount of housing available, but whether that might help with housing choice as well. It might be worth you sort of further expanding a bit upon the land assembly concept and challenge as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'll make a point before I get to that, which is that all of this conversation is in the context of Australia's major cities having to move from 100 years of greenfield production into, now thinking much more carefully about how we do infill development. So it's in that context. So we're grappling with a lot of these ideas, and I think we'll come to better solutions as we focus more and more on that topic. And land assembly is important in that area, and we've done at least the back of the envelope calculations that says that if you rely on business as usual, which in our middle ring suburbs is a lot of lot by lot development, we can picture those forms very easily. They're either a dual occupancy or maybe 3 or 4 units along the block, and now there's some quite large ones which are filling out those lots. But there's a constraint by that existing lot size. So we might be getting 3 or 4 times the density. But if we were to assemble more sites, then across 3, 4, 5, 6, or a whole precinct or a whole block, you can imagine quite a diversity of housing types. So everything from 6 to 8 story apartments or units on near the transport corridor, a new piece of open space in the middle of that precinct area with a mixed sort of densities, and all the way down to potentially terrace houses which have their own street address and access to private open space. So you can picture a mixed diversity and density of housing when we've got multiple sites assembled. And the yield we'll get in those places will be much more than the 3 to 4 times 1 that we would have got if we were just relying on business as usual lot by lot development, or it could be more if we do that upfront planning and master planning, which Catherine's been talking about. So I just don't think we can hit the numbers that we're contemplating for the infill task within metropolitan Melbourne unless we start intervening in that way. And as I say, there's historical precedent for this. And back to the workers that you defined in that colourful description at the start of your point. We built housing for workers when we were growing in the post-war era, and we thought about innovations in land development in greenfield areas. We've got to bring those that historical logic back to the task within our infill and established areas to create the diversity and the affordability of housing that we'll need to house that colourful spectrum of workers in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. So for those of you who are watching, you will probably be seeing now a poll coming up on Slido where you can give your feedback on this webinar. We'd love to hear from you both about what you think about this webinar, but also any future webinar topics. Before we finish up, I just want to turn back to you, Matthew, on this issue around the diversity of housing available and that people need. What's Grattan finding on this front with the work you've been doing?
Yeah, for sure, Jonathan. I think one point just on the land assembly point, I think one thing we've seen in Sydney resulting from the large upzonings they've done is that a lot of time the real barrier to land assembly is just that it's not profitable to do. And I actually think one of the things hopefully we'll see now that there is more more potential for transport-oriented upzoning in Melbourne with the activity centres is that hopefully private actors will come together and actually say, you know what, it does make sense for us to assemble land to develop. So I think that is one part of the solution, is just looking to ensure that we, ensure upzoning meets the demand that is in an area, because when we do, I think a lot of private actors will look to develop. On that point around on housing diversity, I think one challenge we have is that I hear a lot of the time this concern, for instance, that we're not seeing enough large apartments, sort of 3-bedroom apartments. And I think part of what that misses is just this desire to look at apartment buildings and say we're going to put a restriction on the number of, say, 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom homes, is that those apartment buildings are actually building into an existing housing context where we have a lot of very large homes, which are often the more affordable option for families. So just saying we should allow more apartments in an area in general can have a really positive impact on making that area more affordable for families, because a lot of the people who say would like to downsize from those large homes can benefit from the new apartments we're building, say the new 2-bed apartments or 1-bed apartments, and that actually has the broader market impact of making these areas more affordable for families, because there are already a lot of larger single family homes in a lot of cases that are the homes that families used to own but often have become too expensive for them because we're not soaking up enough of that demand that's occurring. So I think thinking about this in the broader market context really matters. And I think the final point I'd make there is just we've seen a lot, I think, of planning regulations over time that have a particular normative sense of what a home should look like for families. And one of, I think, the interesting results we're seeing out of the United States when they researched what a family is looking for in terms of apartments. Often families are looking for quite small bedrooms when it comes to kids. They don't necessarily prioritize one larger bedroom. If they could have an opportunity for 2 smaller bedrooms, they would look at that. So thinking about how the planning regulations, the design guides we have actually allow families to choose homes that meet their needs, I think is something that we should think about if we're trying to allow for more family-friendly development within our existing infill areas.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And of course, that comes back again to understanding the choices people want to make and unlocking some of those choices. We've certainly covered a lot of ground. This webinar was billed as Victoria's housing puzzle. I think we've been able to both look at the puzzle, look at some of the pieces, and importantly connect some of those pieces in terms of what the solution might be, particularly those connections between housing, better planning, and better infrastructure policy and investments as well. I really want to thank our special guests, Catherine, Matt, and Patrick, for all of your insights in this webinar today, and for all of you who've joined us to watch the webinar and put forward your great questions. Please join us for some of our future webinars. We're going to be continuing to dive a bit deeper into some of the areas of recommendations that we've had in our 30-year infrastructure strategy, as well as some exciting new research that's coming out from Infrastructure Victoria in coming months, including on things like implications of climate change for the infrastructure that we have now and over coming decades. So on that bombshell, thank you for joining us, and goodbye for now.